you get this in Marvel a lot where it's like, oh, I'm going to do the right thing because it's the right thing. It's like, well, you literally dropped everything to do this. Like, is this, you really sacrificing everything for this random person because it's quote unquote the right thing to do? I think that's a hard motive to use, and it's hard to buy. And it's just used a lot in films, and not super compelling, in my opinion. Sorry.
Well, it's not personal.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we have back with us one of our favorite co-hosts, Avalon, to review the recent release from Netflix, The Electric State. It's a 2025 science fiction action-adventure film. The screenplay was by Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, and it was directed by Anthony and Joe Russo, the Russo brothers. So, if those are familiar, it's because both of those groups have previously worked together on Marvel films, which we have reviewed on this podcast, and they brought this film to us today. Just a bit of a disclaimer. I have a bit of a cough, so if things sound a bit off for any reason, that's probably going to be why, and you might hear similar sentiments from my counterpart in this episode. But regardless, let's get those initial impressions. Avalon, what was your first thoughts having watched The Electric State?
So, this is a very niche fandom, I guess you could say I'm slightly a part of. The fan of Simon Stalinog's work, his art and graphic novels, more or less. And The Electric State, the movie, is based on a book he wrote. So to put it bluntly, I'm kind of disappointed with what we got in this movie because it doesn't measure up in some ways. Now, that being said, there's only so much you can do with the story of this particular book, so I can't really fault them necessarily for everything they did in this movie. But even from a storytelling perspective, this movie still fumbles the ball on several key points. So, even just from a storytelling perspective.
Yeah, and what was the rating you ended up giving this film?
I gave it a 3.1.
Oh, wow. That's pretty low. I thought I was being aggressive with my review, but I think you beat me out on that one. I was surprised by how formulaic I felt like this film was. This was definitely one of those films when I was watching it, I went, okay, hero's journey, blah, blah, blah. This is happening next. This is happening next. Oh, look what happened next. And so I didn't think that every component of this was horrible, but there was definitely a sense in which they really, I felt like they were trying to play it safe, and it really didn't hit the mark because of that. So I personally gave it a 5.6. I thought it was okay, but there was definitely some serious problems with it, and we'll get into exactly why that's the case today. It is also interesting because they spent a lot of money to produce this film, about $320 million, which puts it up there as one of the most expensive films that they've made. So, this was no joke when it came to the effort they put into this film. And so I was surprised that, one, it wasn't advertised more, and two, that it just wasn't the caliber that I was hoping would come out of this film. So, anyways, but if you are unfamiliar with The Electric State, Avalon, can you give the people the summary of what The Electric State is about?
So, the movie The Electric State is about a girl named Michelle who has lost her family due to some car accident. But she lives in a alternate version, I guess you could say, of the U.S., where there was some kind of robot war, and now society is hooked on these Neurocasters, which is like a form of VR entertainment, and work. They're also used for work, I guess. She doesn't use one, though, and a robot comes to her house and leads her to believe that the consciousness of her brother is inhabiting it. And so she follows it in an attempt to figure out what's going on. That's the basic plot line where she goes on this journey to try to follow this robot.
Yeah. And it starts off like that. It's pretty I think one of the things that I was confusing, so I'm not as familiar with the original writer's work, right? Who wrote the
Hmm.
short story and all of that stuff and the concept art that has inspired this. That being said, I was curious to see how they took some of the concepts and portrayed them, right? What those bird-like masks that everyone is wearing, the machines, the massive world. So I was somewhat surprised by how cohesive it all was. But that being said, with the cohesiveness, it was not perfect. There was definitely things that fell apart. But we'll get into that today. So the opening scene, right? We see this opening scene where you get to know her and her brother, who's this genius, and then you get the montages of the war and stuff like that. What were your thoughts on that opener? Was it good at catching your attention, getting you engaged, all that stuff?
Well, it is good at establishing the brother-sister relationship. I thought it did a decent job just establishing who they were in relation to each other and what kind of brother-sister dynamic they have. However, that being said, I didn't feel like the montage and everything else gave us a whole lot to be invested in the world and plot from the get-go, aside from the siblings.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of felt stereotyped and kind of way too clean and way too distant for
Mm-hmm.
me to be personally as an audience member invested in what was happening.
Interesting.
So
Just because the world was so incredibly different from ours.
no, I don't. It isn't just because it was different from ours. I can't really and maybe it's just the way they handled the montage. Maybe it
Mm,
was just the way that they showed the events happening. I just found myself kind of becoming distant from the story through the montage for the opening scene. So,
interesting.
and maybe it's just a personal thing for me. Maybe it has nothing wrong necessarily with the opener. It's just my personal take.
I think you're not wrong, right? I think that there's definitely something there. I think but I didn't necessarily take it away from that section. I think the bigger problem I was seeing is there was something about the robots themselves that was hard for me to grasp and believe personally and get invested in them. And I'm not really sure what that was because they tried very hard to humanize and relate the robots to us. Um, but yeah, I don't really know exactly where that disconnect was. So I don't know if that's where you're going for. That's what I personally saw, but you know, I thought the opening was decent.
It wasn't a bad opening. I just didn't think it was a great opening.
Sure. I mean, honestly, the main thing is that it establishes the character of Michelle Greene, who is the protagonist of the film. What are your thoughts on her as a character? Is she compelling? What's great about her? What's not?
I think she's flawed. I don't know if she's compelling. Because she's definitely kind of a selfish character in some regards. And she's also a little bit stuck in the past, refusing to
Mm-hmm.
let go of her family's deaths and what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, refusing to move on from certain things. So, in that way, she is definitely flawed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't hugely, didn't find it hugely compelling, maybe, is my problem. I guess throughout the story, I wasn't, fully, like, invested in her and her struggle. And there was almost a part of me that would have been kind of okay if she died or something. I don't know. I didn't want to say
Okay.
that out. That's kind of what my take was.
Interesting. So you didn't think that she was compelling as a character to get behind and support for the sake of the plot.
Well, the other problem is I'm trying to be fair here as well. Is that because there's a lot of other characters that are worse than she is, but some of her decisions, I guess, I question throughout the
Okay.
story. I guess
you want to give an example?
well, okay. I guess the best way to describe my problem isn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily with her, but maybe it's her interaction with the world at large. Because obviously this is a different world.
Sure.
Um, but I guess there is an aspect of this world where we're not a lot of things aren't fully explained. And like for example, her school requires all students to use their neurocaster, and she
Mm-hmm.
refuses to use it, and that gets her in trouble. And I guess the decision behind that by the school is never fully explained. Um,
Sure. Well, it's also not explained why she is so rebellious against using it specifically.
yes, no, yeah, that's the other problem. Like, it's never explained why she doesn't want to use the neurocaster.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, this is taken from the book where the main character, I forget if her name is Michelle still in the book, but in the book, she doesn't use neurocasters, but it's because she has a she has like a DNA problem where it's like her brain can't interface with the
Okay.
technology in the book. In the movie, they have this thing where she doesn't want to use the neurocaster, but then she ends up using it at the end to interface with her brother in the machine.
Right.
So, which kind of undermines her whole reason for like whatever reason she had for not using it before. And it's not even fully explained why she's suddenly willing to use it then at the end of the movie.
Sure. I mean, that one would make some sense to play the devil's advocate because it's like, oh, she can now finally talk to her brother, But at
Yeah.
the same time, it does show perhaps that she's not as fundamentally opposed to this technology as she acts like she is at the beginning. And it's also
Mm.
not clear why. Like, she says that her family died from a car accident with a deer, right? So it's not like she has specific ties to her family or anything like that that tell her or that tell us as the audience that we should believe that she doesn't want to use this.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I think that that's a fairish critique. The only thing you can really see is that she sees the detriment overall on society of this technology and how it's hurting people.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. I don't think that I find that super compelling, but it is somewhat of a motive. She does give the motive that she has a disability, so she can't use it, but it sounds like an excuse in the film. And
Mm.
obviously, she uses it later, so it was an excuse.
Yeah.
Anyways, but yeah, I think I see where you're coming from. I don't know that I personally found Millie Bobby Brown's character that compelling. I think she had good motive and good reason for being involved in the plot, but like it, I don't know. There was definitely a disconnect there.
Mm.
Cool. Well, let's move on to some of the other characters here. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on Keats when he first gets introduced and his friend Herman? Um, do you think that they're a compelling duo? What are your thoughts?
Keats is just Chris Pratt playing Chris Pratt. Um,
Basically,
and as far as Herman, Herman's okay, but I did find him like I guess Keats and Herman's motives also in this movie is a little questionable. Like, why are they going along with this a little bit? Because they're kind of established as selfish characters who are out for themselves to get money.
hmm right?
So when they kind of go along with Michelle and her brother Chris, it's kind of like it's not fully believable.
Because that would be a very selfless act for them to do, and that's what they do.
Mm.
Yeah, I see that.
So, and as far as all, and most of the side characters in this movie, most of them don't seem to really have much of a motive. The only character who really has much of a motive, side character wise, is Mr. Peanut, the leader of the robots. But that's
Right.
because they kind of established that through the montage, and when you meet him, he's just trying to keep the peace.
Yeah, he's the political leader of the robots, which is kind of interesting. Um,
Voiced by Woody Harrelson, no less.
oh really?
Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah, they had some decent actors in this film for sure.
Mm-hmm.
They definitely didn't skimp on that. I personally liked Keats. I thought he was a decent character, but I could just see how his motive was not that strong, especially post the whole um why was he involved in Michelle Greene's issue with her brother? Not super clear after a certain point in the film, other than
Mm,
it's the right thing to do, and you get this in Marvel a lot where it's like, oh, I'm gonna do the right thing because it's the right thing. It's like, well, you literally dropped everything to
mm.
do this. Like, is this you really sacrificing everything for this random person because it's quote unquote the right thing to do? I think that's a hard motive to use, and it's hard to buy, and it's just used a lot in films, and not super compelling in my opinion. Sorry.
Well, it's not personal. It's one of those
Hmm.
like motives that's like, oh, it's a generic like, oh, this is the morally right thing to do, so I'm gonna do that. But it doesn't
Hmm.
really like link back to the character. It doesn't say anything about who they are as a person necessarily. It's just so generic. All it says is something about their morals.
Right.
Nothing, nothing else.
Unfortunate. But what were your thoughts on? I mean, I guess you mentioned Mr. Peanut having decent motive. I
Hmm.
don't know if you want to talk any more about him or Amherst the doctor or anything like that.
Who is Amherst again? I'm trying to remember.
He's the doctor character that they go to find in the middle of Table Mountain or whatever.
Oh, I mean, he's kind of a character that fills a plot device, where he's like he explains the plot, but he wasn't a bad character though. He was kind of just. It's more or less like they just didn't give him enough time for character development, if that makes sense. I
Hmm.
guess. I felt like he was an okay character. I mean, all characters in this movie considered, he was like okay.
No, I agree. I think that for Amherst, he's one of those characters that definitely, in my opinion, was fulfilling a lot more of that hero's journey esque thing, which very clearly this guy is portraying relevant information to push the plot along so that we know where we're going with this. So I didn't find it super compelling, but he was necessary for the plot, so he wasn't bad. Fine, whatever. But he could have been better, and it could have done so much more with it, which is unfortunate that they did not.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the villain in this film, Ethan
Oh wait, I
Skate?
guess there is one side character we should talk about.
Okay,
Christopher.
I guess that's true. Yeah, we should probably talk about Christopher. What are your thoughts on the robot and then the actual person, since they're technically connected?
I mean, I want to say he. I don't. I kind of want to say he's one of the more compelling characters of the story, but that's also because his character is limited. Where it's like, as this robot, was it? What's the name of the robot? Shoot.
I think she just calls it Chris.
Well, it's named Chris, but the robot actually has a
Oh,
name.
Cosmo.
Cosmo. That's right. Uh, it's essentially
Wait,
just a
so for
scripted
the audience's
lines.
perspective, Cosmo is this cartoon they used to watch, and there's a robot version of the cartoon character called Cosmo, and this
Mm,
is the form that Chris's consciousness chooses to embody in the film.
mm,
So that's what you get following Michelle Greene / Millie Bobby Brown's character
yeah,
around in the film.
but Cosmo, the robot, has pre-recorded lines. He doesn't actually. He can't articulate everything he's
Hmm.
thinking.
Right.
So in that regard, his character is interesting. Where it's like he tries to communicate several scenes, but he can only say certain things.
Hmm.
So in some ways, his character was like you see him responding to the world because when you get to the end of the movie, you see he's been essentially locked up, so he
Hmm.
hasn't experienced the world. So when you reframe the scenes with Cosmo earlier in the movie, realize he's reacting to scenes, what's happening, to what Center is doing, and all of that's happening in the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. I hadn't really thought about that aspect of it.
Yeah,
I definitely think that they were going for this Bumblebee-esque, I can't talk very well, so I'm going to use what elements in my ability here to communicate with you. It's an
yeah.
interesting technique. Yeah, I don't know. I think the Cosmo Bot is I don't know why I found that so hard to buy just this relationship between this robot and Millie Bobby Brown's character is like so weird, and
It
she gets
was
on board
weird.
pretty fast. And
I agree. It is weird.
I don't know. I think that right, that whole aspect of her going, "Oh my goodness, this robot is actually my brother," even though he can't really communicate well. Like that whole aspect is the premise of this film, and I don't know if it felt so out there or it felt disingenuous or what, but that dynamic didn't work for me. And because of that, I think that the whole film suffered. That being said, I tried to give it the benefit of a doubt and say, well, even though I didn't buy that, like, what aspects of the film were still good, which is why it got a 5.6 for me.
Okay.
Anyways, we should probably move on to the villains. What are your thoughts on Bradbury and then Ethan Skate?
Bradbury, that's the Colonel, right?
Yeah.
It is the second time within a month I feel like I've been disappointed by Giancarlo.
Oh, really?
Uh, and it's sad because, I mean, at first he's promising
Mm-hmm.
because it's like, oh, he's this colonel from the war. He has a reputation, and he does. And there's definitely several scenes where he clearly has skills, and he can clearly survive for a bit, or at least his drone can. But that being said, as the movie progresses, it becomes apparent he really just has an antagonism towards robots, not towards people. And I guess while it makes sense, his change of heart towards the end of the movie, there's also a part of me that felt like, yeah, it felt a little cliche, though.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So
Like,
I was just
his...
like, yeah, I could see this coming, but I wasn't happy with this.
Okay, interesting. I thought it was, like, an okay fulfillment of his arc where he goes from, I do not like robots, to realizing that this person was worse than the robots because of how ruthless and evil he was. So
mm,
him being willing to switch sides for the sake of stopping this bad man was very cliche. Saw it a mile away, right? But
mm,
that also goes back to a feeling like this film was very formulaic, very much the hero's journey just being played out on the big screen. Not a ton of nuance to it. So, um,
mm,
I thought it was a satisfying arc for him personally, but I didn't think that he was an amazing character.
mm.
Um, well, no, I mean, I thought he was a decent character. I will say that. For all of the points in the villain aspect of the film, they all came from Bradbury. I will say that. I
Okay.
think that Bradbury is far more of a compelling villain than Ethan Skate is.
Yeah.
But anyways, feel free to push back. Or what are your thoughts on Ethan Skate? I
No.
mean, he's
Ethan
the leader of
Skate.
Center, which is this technology company that creates the headsets that everyone puts on and the drones that go with them. And he worked together to, fight the war against against the robots when the robots uprose against the people, right? And he helped them to win. So he's kind of like a big figure. Turns out that the reason his technology works is because it runs through the brainchild of Christopher, which is the brother of Michelle Greene, that they thought died in that accident. Turns out he didn't die. He was in a vegetative state, and they used his brain to create this technology because he was just such a wizard genius. So, um, what were your thoughts on Ethan Skate and Center and all of that?
The problem with Ethan Skate is I don't know what they were going for as a character. Felt like they threw a bunch of things together in an attempt to make some kind of villain. And
Uh huh.
some of it, I just was left confused. Is he supposed to be a ruthless businessman? Is he supposed to
Hmm.
be a psycho? Is he supposed to be some
Right.
duplicitous leader? I don't know. Like, there's just several times was like, I wasn't sure what his personality was supposed to be because it felt like it changed throughout the movie.
Yeah, I would agree with that because he starts off as being like, "Oh, I am the kind, caring, whatever leader," and then by the end of the film, he's the very stereotypical, "I'm here to kill everybody and stop everything because that's what I want to do. I want power and I want money and I want to win." Blah 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 blah. Ha ha
Yeah.
ha. And so he doesn't. maintain an air of authenticity in the film. He definitely feels like the stereotypical bad guy of just, oh, ha, ha, I'm here to kill you, and that's pretty much it. And that's just such a terrible villain. Like, I'm sorry, like, that's not. It's hard to buy that, especially because he's the leader of this multi-billion-dollar company, right? So clearly he has some charisma and ability to conduct himself in a way that makes him incredibly successful. So
You know what would have made me love his
I don't
character
know
more?
what.
He was played by Stanley Tucci in this movie. I feel like he
Uh-huh.
should have been played by J.K. Simmons.
Huh.
I think I would have enjoyed his
Lol.
character more if it was played if J.K. Simmons played him instead.
I mean, J.K. Simmons touching a lot of things makes it a lot better. So I could get behind that for sure. What, are you serious? What were your thoughts on the wrap up and ending of the film? Kind of like how we were talking about earlier. Center was using Christopher's bot brain. The consciousness of it leaked out into this other machine, this robot that was walking around and finds Michelle Greene and is trying to save himself, right? It all culminates in the robot version of Christopher getting captured so they can re-upload the consciousness back to the original body. And then Michelle Greene, Keith, and the boys, and everyone else coming to wage war in Seattle against Center and to save Christopher from the clutches of Ethan Skate and the other bad people out there. What are your thoughts on that ending and how they conducted it?
I mean, it's your classic massive fight scene between two opposing forces.
Mm-hmm.
And they made it interesting to watch. They had interesting, things happening on the screen. I mean, there's not really much to say about the fight necessarily itself. Some of the things, the events in the fight, like Bradbury's turn against Center, you could see it coming.
Right.
And some of the other, several robots dying, some characters falling. And then of course Michelle and the robot's double. What's his? I mean, not the robots. I'm sorry. The doctor. What's it? Amherst, his robot double. They sneak
Mm-hmm.
into the center to get to Christopher. They interface with him, and that's when we learn that Christopher can't be unplugged from the machine because his body is dependent on the system. So
Right.
literally, the only way for them to free Christopher from this living hell is to turn the machine off, which will effectively kill him.
Right.
I mean, and also destroy the entire center network. So,
Mm-hmm.
also implying that everyone who's addicted to the center VR system will no longer have it.
Right. Exactly.
So his sister has to make the choice to essentially kill her own brother,
Mm-hmm.
and that is which I'll say is one of the more interesting parts of the whole movie because it's definitely a moral dilemma
Mm-hmm.
that is actually, no matter how you look at it, it's a difficult decision.
And I will say, like, of all of the parts of the film, this one played into what they were trying to talk about thematically, let me just say,
Yeah.
compared to other areas of the film, right? They definitely leaned hard into it, and they did that well. So, in this film, there's definitely a lot of aspects in which Millie Bobby Brown's character is dealing with her past and her family and overcoming that and reconciling her past. And this brings it to a head where she's like, I'm finally reunited with my brother. And in order to truly reconcile with her past and make uh, full circle, if you will, she's going to have to unplug her brother and come to terms with that. And that is the, like, It's definitely interesting. Like it's a difficult decision to make, but it's clearly what he wanted, and it would stop the villains from killing more machines. Which that was another side discussion in this film: is are machines human or like real or not, or do they have
Yeah.
rights? Do robots have rights if they're sentient? Things like that. So there's definitely they do well thematically, I would say, in this film, especially on that aspect.
Yeah.
But is there other themes or ideas in this film that you would think are worth discussing?
I feel like the two major themes, you kind of highlighted one of them with the whole robot thing, where it's
Hmm.
like, if the robot is sentient enough and self-aware, does it have rights? Is it technically a person now? Like that
Hmm.
whole like thematic, like at what point do you treat something as human or as uh, equal?
Hmm.
That's like one of the major themes of the story. The other is kind of the whole idea of focusing on what is real and the people around you. Because like keeps
Hmm.
showing the whole like all these scenes of people being plugged into the neuros casters, into their center networks, even homeless people and like people strung out on the street. It's like kind of disturbing, though. I mean, admittedly, some of it is like scenes adapted from Stalinhog's work from his books, so
Hmm.
it's not completely original. No, I'd say those are the two major themes, like focusing, like what is real, like focusing on what's real and the people around you is
Hmm.
like one of the major themes, and then the whole idea of life and sentience.
Yeah, definitely. And you get them more so with like Mr. Peanut and the other robots as they're fighting for their rights and things like that.
Hmm.
So it's interesting. I think that they don't necessarily terminate it super, I guess, clearly. Other than, I don't know, maybe it was the obvious assumption that, okay, so they won the war. Clearly they have rights, or something like that. I don't know.
Hmm.
It I think they could have done more in that department, and they didn't. But that's the theme for a lot of things that they did in this film. So yeah, that's what you get.
Hmm.
Overall, what are your thoughts on the film? Do you think it has a lasting impact? Did it leave you satisfied? What are your thoughts?
I don't know. I guess in my mind, I was expecting certain things because there's definitely like an atmosphere and a feeling to Stalinhog's work.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a little initially excited when I heard about this movie from a trailer. Then I watched a trailer and I was like, oh, this is gonna be one of those movies. And then I was like, that toned down my expectations quite a bit. I don't know if this movie in and of itself is gonna have a lasting impact. It's too like
Mm-hmm.
much of a stereotype, too many cliches running throughout it. And characters regularly do things in this movie that annoyed the crap out of me. As like, I call them stupid decisions. Like, why did you do that?
Mm-hmm.
And even the movie seems to acknowledge it was a stupid decision. Like within a minute, and it's like, okay, like why? What kind of character is this?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't have high hopes for this movie, and
Right.
for fans of Stalinhog's work, if you actually want to watch something that's good, buy it. Go to Amazon Prime and watch Tales from the Loop because that's way better than this.
Well, I mean, I know for myself, not being a fan of Stalinhog's work, um, I thought it was an interesting exploration of an idea, right?
Hmm.
Did I personally enjoy it? It was fine. I think that they could have done a lot better. Felt very, very formulaic, as I've said a lot in this podcast, and I don't think that that's going to help it to be a film that lasts time, right?
Hmm.
When people look at famous films or things that will be in the annals of history of like, oh, that was an incredible idea or an interesting concept, I don't think that this one's going to be in it. And I think
Hmm.
it's a lot of it has to do with how the story was being told. Because I think they had a lot of interesting concepts and original work to work with to make a compelling story or to make it at least a more compelling story. And I just think they fumbled the ball. So,
Yeah.
anyways, that's it. That's the pod. We hope you all enjoyed. We will be back as we always are next week. We'll see you all then.